Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you this morning?
I am just fine, just fine. So how about you?
How is the sound for you?
I can hear you fine.
Good morning. No, you're muted.
All right, let's try again. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Bobby is not going to be on today, so transcription is not as important. I
Okay.
noticed that I do not have the transcription button down on my computer either. So there's something when it is set up that transcription doesn't seem to be available.
Okay. Well, I
Okay.
I even took a screenshot because what I'm hearing from the, kind of tech guys is you have this button. I'm like, I really don't. I would see it. So,
Yeah, you would, because I've had it before and I've turned it on when I've been host, but it has to be set up before the session starts in order to be able to have that transcription button available. I may be able to get on and see how it's set up. I know Gary's done it, but I can look also and see if we can figure out what's happening.
Meeting. All right.
Gary is out for a couple days.
Yeah.
And John Holman has been working on it too. So I think we'll get a solution. I wonder if it's because I'm not the host technically, but then when Gary and I were working on that, he made me a co-host and I still didn't have that option. But thank you for
Yeah.
letting me know that, Bobby. I've been worried about that.
Yeah, Bobby is not on today. She had bought tickets to go to the Van Gogh exhibit in St. Louis long before the class was announced.
Understood.
So,
It's worth it. It's that exhibit is fascinating.
is it? I have not been to St. Louis, but I've been to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam.
Oh, same.
And
That's a
yeah,
great thing. This is not that at all. It's in a huge tent in the parking lot of a mall. And so they project the paintings or parts of the paintings. I mean, it's huge and they move. So first you go through and there's a lot of information on hanging panels that are illuminated. And then you come into this and the floor is included and the top of the tent. So all of his flower paintings, for example, they project those all at the same time, and then you have some time to take them in, but then the flowers begin to grow like out of the panel. It's really different. It is.
oh, okay. Well, maybe we'll consider getting and going if it's still available.
I think it goes to the end of the month of November, almost.
Okay.
I didn't know what to expect, and it's really different.
Yeah.
But we love the Van Gogh Museum, the walking down through the paintings. Good morning.
The Van Gogh thing goes to January 1st.
January 1st, really?
Mhm.
I thought it went to the end of November. Okay.
Well,
very
I thought
good.
I saw January 1st. And we're going later today, so.
I was so shocked too to be at a mall that had people in it. We had to duck in. Somebody needed a Christmas present that they sell at Macy's. It was like a mall with stores and shoppers. I mean, that's so.
Yeah, right.
Didn't know what to do with ourselves.
Yeah.
Communicating with people on this issue through 3 or 4 different media. So emailing some and messaging some and texting some. So it's keep trying to see who's getting back to me. Oh, you've got some bacchanalia behind you today, Anne. I see the grapes. Oh, that's amazing. Did anyone see Disney's Fantasia back in the day?
Yeah.
Bacchus is the Romans version of Dionysus. So to the Greeks, Dionysus was a fairly serious topic. But to the Romans, Bacchus is just party central. He doesn't have
right.
any sense of the prophet scorned in his own land or any of those kind of more serious aspects to the story. But I do love that part of Fantasia. Good morning, Sarah. I see your name.
Good morning.
Thank you.
So I didn't get a link. I didn't get anything from Jackie Welsh this morning, but I just used the old link and it worked.
Same.
Yeah, okay.
I think I just need to, bookmark it and I think we used the same one for the whole class. Has that been the case before?
Sometimes.
And I did get an updated class list. I did get an email from her, but it didn't have a separate link. So we use the same one. Good morning, Carol.
Am I on the class list now, Katie?
Yes. Yep. Everybody else just stay home yesterday because that was the only possible thing to do on such a chilly, rainy day. I didn't leave. I barely left the house. I didn't leave. Barely. Good morning, Esther. Good morning, Nancy. I wonder if you can use your reaction buttons if you don't have video. I'm gonna try something. Interesting. Can you see the little waving hand up in the corner? Even,
Yes.
thank you, Sarah. I'm glad you're excited. And there's Nancy with video and Esther with video. Good morning.
Hi. I'm still cramming, just like when I was in college. I haven't finished my reading.
Well, I have so much material after doing it this long, but it's such a different way to present it that I feel unprepared, but I'm actually probably over prepared. So
Oh, I love it.
we'll see how the day goes. Good morning, Donna.
Good morning. I love it too.
You have some crazy stories today. I guess that's not a nice word to use. Complex. We have some complex stories.
Is there, is someone or you wanting Katie to change the time of the class to 10? I keep getting something about that.
It's not coming
Weird.
through me, and I
No,
haven't heard anything about it.
it's from Jackie. It's whatever.
I didn't.
About
the
this
meeting.
class?
Yeah, it's weird. It's just, maybe it's just something that's automatically on there. I don't know. I haven't done anything about it. It just,
Is she asking for like an opinion?
yeah, it looks like it, but I don't know why if you didn't ask for it.
Mm-mm.
Anyway, don't worry about it. I'll ignore it.
Okay, also maybe forward that to me later or when you think of it so I can see what's happening and
Well, it's just something that comes up when she offers the invitation to join the meeting and all this other stuff pops up. It just, don't worry about it. I don't think I could forward it. It's gone now. It's not part of the message.
okay.
Don't
So it
worry.
wasn't an email. That's okay. We'll
No, not from her directly. I don't know why it would pop up, but
we'll see if anyone joins us at 10. Good morning, Mary.
Good morning. I'll try again. Hi.
We have 13. Just wait another minute or two. Keep going. I can read any of my notes. Okay, that's 9:32.
I
Let's go. Good
I
morning,
need to go
Jill.
get my, morning. I have to go get my
Yeah.
book and I'll be right back.
You may go
upstairs.
ahead.
Okay.
Good morning, Alan. Let's see who else has joined us. Look, I'm popping in. Good morning, Alan. I apologize. Did you get my email this morning? You were not on my original class list. And so I forwarded this morning some materials to you. So, just in case you're a speed reader. Or maybe you have to cram like Esther. Cramming works short term. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I spent a lot of time in higher ed. You don't retain it, but
Yeah.
retain it long enough for the exam. Okay, so a couple of things. I'm still working on, the class is being recorded. So there are people who let me know ahead of time they can't be here for one class or another. So if that's you in any of the next couple of classes, the classes are recorded. We're working on turning on closed captioning if that's helpful for you. Hope we'll be able to do that by next week. I sent an email Sunday with some resources, just a couple of links, and gave you the option of opting out if you prefer not to get that. So if you didn't get an email from me, if you still haven't gotten a schedule, anything like that, if you're not getting email, just let me know in the chat and I'll make sure that I check my list. I did get an updated class list today. And so that's where we are now. I maybe want to start with a couple of questions I got by email. great questions, one of which I had never thought of. The first one had to do with the names of the gods and goddesses in that first chapter. So we know Apollo, we know Athena, you know, a little bit about who they are and what they represent. And someone texted, so why does it say Pallas Athena and Phoebus Apollo? What are those parts of their names? And they're both considered epithets. We probably know that word epithet, and if you're like me, you think of it as meaning kind of a bad word. I think it goes all the way back to Watergate, and the transcripts all said, the transcripts of Richard Nixon said epithet deleted. I think that's where in my head it became an epithet, as a bad word. But is it echoey to you? Is the sound weird to you?
Yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I don't know what to do. Maybe I need to move my microphone a little closer. That will help a little. I'm back in my small room and using the hotspots. Anyway, so as I think I said last week, ancient Greek poetry was an incredibly complex verse form. If there are any poetry nerds out there, it's dactylic hexameter. Was excited to learn that. That has to do with the number of syllables in a line. So a dactyl is a collection of syllables, stressed and unstressed syllables. Hexameter means there are 8 of those in a line. So epithets were used to fill that and create that pattern. So sometimes she's just Athena, but sometimes she's Pallas Athena. Sometimes she's gray-eyed or flashing-eyed Athena. And those things, still hearing a weird echo. I really apologize. Maybe I'll talk more quietly. Those things were used to fill out a line of poetry. As far as their origins, I wasn't able to find out anything. Pallas may have been connected to the word for wisdom, but that's not definitive. There's not a consensus on that. And he has to do with light. And that's always associated with Apollo. He's the god of light. So those 2 things. And the other one had to do with the maiden goddesses. Is there significance in the fact that there are 3 virgin goddesses? Probably. Things appear in these. The iteration of the female in mythology goes from maiden to mother to crone. So that notion of maiden, mother, crone as you know, being a woman's lifespan. And remaining a virgin was really contrary to the idea of well, women's role to begin with. So it was always something that had to be requested. You had to request permission to remain a virgin from Zeus, because that was, you know, contrary to the notion of building a society. And so there are lots and lots of maidens who just want to hunt, or they just want to be left alone. They ask permission to remain a virgin. That often ends badly because some of the gods don't respect that request. And so that there is often a seduction or a rape, or having to flee from a god and transform yourself into something else to avoid that fate worse than death, that idea that I didn't want to take part in that aspect of life. So interesting questions. Please feel very free to pop them in chat or email. Is that what it is, the feedback? All right. Does that help? Is everyone's muted now? Guess we just have to wait and see. So along with, thank you, Sarah. Along with epithets, the concept of an epithet is always a descriptor. And one of the things to pay attention to as you go through the Hamilton book, if that's what you're using, is she has a tiny italicized paragraph at the beginning of chapters and or stories. And I always used to tell my community college students, just because it's in italics doesn't mean you can skip it. You should still read it. What that is giving you is the author or some background to the story. So in the introduction, Hamilton talked a little bit about the poets and playwrights. And I think you'll begin to sense when a story is Homeric, meaning told with great detail, with great sophistication, with style and flair. You'll see a large number of those epithets. I mean, Homer never says the sea. It is always the wine dark sea. So those epithets are a little bit dressier, and that's Homeric. The plainer and simpler stories are often from Hesiod. He was the farmer. He was the one who was just profoundly different purposes. Homer was speaking to a more sophisticated class and was trying to inspire the warrior ethos. So a lot of these stories he just wasn't interested in. They had nothing to do with his audience or his purpose. So the little descriptors at the beginning of the stories will tell you that. If you are wondering how to pronounce something, there are dozens of websites that will be thrilled to do that for you. So if you just type in how to pronounce Dionysus, you may get 2 sites who tell you 2 different ways, because at the end of the day, we don't really know. But as long, you know, no one here will care if you ask a question or use someone's name and you don't put the emphasis on the right syllable. We won't know the difference, so don't be concerned about that. Another concept that we're going to run across in these first chapters is the concept of a motif. If I didn't talk about that last week briefly, a motif is a story part. Almost everything we have of mythology comes from either the Iliad or the Odyssey. Those were both Homeric. They were both told in this elaborate verse form. So, and they were composed to be performed orally. These were not initially books. And so certainly no poet would ever recite the Iliad. It would take days or weeks. So these little standalone parts, the part where Hector's body is dragged around the gates of Troy, or the part where Odysseus encounters the Cyclops, that would be the story that would be requested or performed at a dinner or a festival. So you could use those same little story parts repeatedly, and they would help that poet remember that. They make oral composition much easier. And in fact, some parts of the Iliad, some scholars say that 1/3 of the lines in the Iliad are repeated somewhere else in the poem. So it's just kind of a handy little shortcut, almost like Once Upon a Time or They Lived Happily Ever After. It's kind of a memory aid. So motifs are story parts, but they're also patterns, and they recur because they were significant. So things like how you treat strangers. When Demeter appeared, another motif is the gods disguising themselves to appear on Earth, sort of a, WWGD. So when Demeter appeared on Earth as an old woman, and Metanera's family immediately took her in and fed her and housed her and sheltered her, that's what you were supposed to do. That wasn't an unusual act, that was an expected act. So that motif of the gods in disguise, and the motif of hospitality in Dionysus' story. We have several of the hero motifs. I'll talk about those in just a minute. Another frequent story part or frequent element of a story is called the rash promise. That, what can I do for you? I'll do anything. And as I said last week, cue the scary music because something bad is coming down when you say, I promised by the river Styx. One of the worst things you could be in the eyes of Zeus was an oath breaker. And that comes from people beginning to have to live together, right? So with agriculture, with urban life, when people have to have these long-term relationships, there have to be agreements. There have to be rules, there have to be contracts. So, and you have to be able to depend on those. So the notion of being an oath breaker is a bad sin or a bad crime. Yeah, so let's hop right into Demeter and Dionysus. Let me stop for a quick second. Anybody have anything they have been thinking about from last week? Not even necessarily questions, but something that stuck with you. Maybe you told somebody else about, or anybody want to share something? It was like, no, it was all gone. All right. I'll try to be more memorable this week. So we have the gods and goddesses. We have our big pantheon chapter. We have some of what are called demigods, meaning one parent or the other was divine. Those figures take on some supernatural elements, some extraordinary elements. So this next chapter, it's a little short one, and it's an interesting juxtaposition, both in terms of following the pantheon, but also the two figures themselves of Demeter, the goddess of grain. I mean, Hamilton makes it crystal clear why those two are linked. They're the ones closest to humans. Both stories illustrate birth, death, resurrection, rebirth, renewal. They do it in different ways. They also are linked in that they are the only gods who suffer. And that seems to be, especially Dionysus, which is as Hamilton notes, is a very late story. Homer doesn't tell it. It's not of interest to him. That wasn't a story that he would have ever needed to tell as part of either of his great narratives. But it is important to Hesiod, and not Hesiod, it is important to some of the later writers. And she says the story is even as late as maybe the 4th century. So if you look at the progression, you see this very old story, this much later story. And I don't think the parallels to the Christian stories of Jesus are hard to spot, right? I mean, it seems pretty clear that persecuted in your own land and performing miracles and feared by the powers that be, the divine sorrowing mother of Demeter. It's pretty clear that that sort of transitional figure, that God that humans could relate to in a really visceral way, that seems to have been important. And it certainly paved the way for a culture in which we had a figure that was human and divine. So those stories are important in that way. So Demeter showing people how to cultivate corn, that was the beginning of settled life on Earth. It seems we always think of urban life and rural life, or farming as opposites, but in fact, without farming, you would have no urban life at all, that we would still just wander. There's been a lot of research, much of which is speculation, about the Eleusinian mysteries, about the mysteries, the festivals devoted to the goddess Demeter. But I think Hamilton kind of sums up all organized religion in a way by saying they gave humanity a way to live joyfully and die with hope. What else is there, right? Live with joy and die with hope. That seems deeply significant. They were the suffering gods because they both experienced death. That's the one thing the gods of the pantheon, the immortals, never had to experience. Death and then rebirth. So in Hamilton's little prologue to these stories, she says, the gods were far removed from suffering and the mortals destined to die, but in pain or at the hour of death, mortals could turn for compassion to the goddess who sorrowed and the goddess who died. So besides bread and corn and grain being essential to humans, Demeter also gave humans a figure to, I guess, pray to worship, because she got it in a way that none of the other gods and goddesses could ever. So she got it. Demeter is the local iteration of Gaia. She's not Gaia. She's not the earth goddess. But she became a sort of grain goddess. Persephone's father, Persephone is her daughter, who was kidnapped by Hades. Persephone is the daughter of Zeus. In some versions of this story, and again, every story has multiple variants. So the basic elements may remain the same, but some of the details may change. So in some versions of the story, Zeus promised Persephone to Hades. So that makes Hades a little more sympathetic, right? He didn't just arbitrarily come and snatch some pure young maiden. It's like, well, there's my wife. I guess it's time to go get her because she's wandered far from her friends and I have this opportunity. So not every story, but in some versions he'd been promised without consulting Demeter. Demeter is always blonde, blue-eyed, sort of a very womanly figure. She represents fertility. So not sex like Aphrodite, because those were not the same thing. And in fact, they weren't even necessarily connected, especially in the early stories. So procreation. Her Roman name is Ceres, that's where we get our word cereal, because grain is essential in every way. And again, Demeter was really in charge before the invasion of the Mycenaeans, before they came and supplanted her with Zeus. She, in some stories, resists that takeover, but ultimately kind of compromises. But she, importantly, doesn't become Zeus's wife. She becomes his sister. So to those early matriarchal societies, that made them more equal. So a husband-wife relationship is different from a brother-sister relationship. So she kind of resists that. So in the same way that you can observe the seasons, and the Greeks were literal thinkers and personifiers, you say, well, things grow, things bloom, they grow, they die. There's some reason for this. And we talked last time about the definitions of myth, but there are also just a handful of types of myth. And many of them have to do with nature, and particularly of explanation. There are stories that explain earthquakes, and stories that explain thunder, and stories that explain volcanoes. And this story in particular seems designed to explain the seasons. So birth, life, death, rebirth. Those stories of explanation. And again, it represents hospitality. So the Demeter's story it tells us a lot about female relationships, that mother-daughter relationship in particular. Women thrive on, require companionship, close companionship. This seems to be what was reflected in these stories, that we need that fellowship with other women, whether it's a daughter, a friend, a mother, companion. So we see Demeter pining, not because she's physically in pain or anything bad necessarily. I mean, anything physically bad has happened to her, but because she's lost the fellowship of her daughter. Hi, Jackie. So maybe to pop in and see about closed captioning. So women thrive on that, and particularly that mother-daughter bond. And remember from last time that one of the ultimate taboos is to do harm to your mother. There's no way to atone for that sin. Any questions about Demeter's story, or any parts that you found of interest? Jill, you want to put it in chat or unmute yourself? You need to unmute yourself, Jill. You're muted.
Yeah, I was just doing a chat question. This is just a very small thing. If did you say that Zeus and Demeter were brother and sister?
Yes.
But then Persephone was the daughter of Demeter and Zeus, right?
Yes.
Or no? So they were
Yes.
like brother and sister, but they. And then another thing I just noticing in both these chapters, Edith Hamilton seems to to act as if the myths were actually things that really happened. Every once in a while, it seems like that's what she's, I don't know. I don't know if anyone else saw that.
Is that problematic for you?
No, just interesting.
I think what she's trying to do is retell the stories with some authenticity. So as a reteller, she wants them to sound like they would have sounded to their original audience and for their original purpose. And so it is interesting, and in literature, we might talk about point of view. So I think you'll notice that she kind of steps in and out of it. So at some points, she's commenting on or reflecting on how they did things. And at other points, she's simply telling stories. So yeah, I think that's a good observation. And she tells them like they actually happened. And even the ancient Greeks didn't need to believe that they actually happened. I mean, I think we see today, we have people who need to believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible that guides their faith. They can reconcile any contradictions. That's really important. Other people who see the Bible or other great religious books as guidelines, as, you know, kind of a sort of more set of guidelines than a set of absolute rules. So I think even the ancient Greeks didn't necessarily firmly believe that these things actually happen. It's, this story shows me something essential about how people live, how I live, how people are, how nature is. And so I think that's what I would say about that. So I find myself drawn to the image of Demeter putting that child in the fire every night to make him immortal. And then the mother coming across that one night and understandably kind of freaking out. But in doing that, so the first part that's interesting to me is that Demeter thought she was doing that child a favor. I don't know. I don't think immortality would be a choice that I would make, right? I think maybe, yeah, to all things there is a season. But she believes that she's blessing this child in some essential way by making him immortal. And it's apparently a long process because she has to put him in the fire night after night. Then the mother comes across and you know, freaks out. But in doing that, she contradicted Demeter's intention. And so that's why Demeter withdrew. She's deeply offended. You weren't supposed to do that. In this case, it was a pretty mild offense. So Demeter does end up, you know, letting the mother atone for this minor sin by building her temple. That's the little story element that I find particularly, maybe visually, really interesting. Demeter does eventually have her daughter return to her, but now we know that when everything dies and the vines and the grain and everything dies back, we know two things. It's because Persephone is in the underworld, but she's going to return. She's going to return and bring with her eternal spring. The Roman name is Persephone. So then we get any other questions or observations about Demeter's story? It's one kids especially love, the notion of why we have springtime. Everything about the story is so visual and so compelling, and there are clear good guys and bad guys, and so kids really like the story of Demeter and Persephone, in my experience. So Demeter is a very early story, and then we're contrasting with Dionysius. It's a very late story. Hamilton says Homer did not admit him, meaning Homer felt no need to write about him, to acknowledge his godhood, etc. He didn't count him in the pantheon. Later stories do include him in that collection of chief gods. So he should be called technically a demigod. His mother was human. Her name was Semele. Zeus was madly in love with her and promised her anything. And because of Hera's jealous intervention, someone says, I want to see you in all your glory. No. So it's interesting, this is the second figure in mythology that's actually birthed by Zeus. Zeus is so powerful, he can even co-opt the one thing that women do that men can't, which is give birth. So he sees he's about to, lose this child. He can't save the mother, but he can save the child. He puts him in his side and protects him. And then Zeus allows Dionysus to be born. Dionysus is then raised in seclusion. So I'm gonna screen share for a minute. I hope. Some of what are known as the hero motifs in ancient Greece. So anyone who's considered a hero, remember that their standards didn't match ours. We'll talk for a minute or in a minute, or if you have any ideas about what you have to be or do to be an American hero. But to the ancient Greeks, these were the parts of the story that were almost always present. So the first one was the hero has an extraordinary parent or parents, often a god or goddess, and or an extraordinary birth story. So sometimes Hera would jealously intervene and one of Zeus's lovers would have to go give birth on a floating island because Hera said, all right, you can't give birth on land, you can't give birth on sea. So examples like that. So there's often something exceptional about the child's birth, almost always something exceptional about the parents. The child is raised apart from the knowledge of their own divinity, right? So they're not a movie star's kid getting all screwed up. They're able to grow up just like a normal kid. And then at adolescence, at adulthood, at that point, they're called to a quest of some kind. This quest is never solely about the individual. It's not, I'm going to go on a quest to prove I'm the strongest guy in the world. The quest always implies helping others or helping groups of people. So at some point, the hero undertakes a quest. And if you looked at that heroic pattern image that I sent from Joseph Campbell, he notes that heroes don't always accept that call willingly. There's the reluctant hero, but off he goes. And another critical element to every hero story is that that hero visits the underworld and returns. So, and also heroes back in the day hardly ever lived happily ever after. They often came to sad and tragic ends or lived out their life in seclusion or some other sad tale. I'll be happy to send you this if you want a hard copy, but that's kind of the pattern. So the visit to the underworld is important. What are the two things you can never defeat? Death and taxes, right? And you, oh, maybe that was my, thought you had your hand up. So this notion of being able to conquer death by going to the underworld and returning is critically important. And we'll see a lot of ways that that's done, but you'll see it over and over again in stories that involve a hero. So Dionysus has the divine childhood. He has the rash promise. He's accepted as a god everywhere but in his own country. Does everyone know the significance of the purple robe, of the color purple? This is a yes or no. Purple is extremely hard to make. Purple dye is very, very difficult to make. There are very few things in nature that will result in purple. So there's certain seashells that are found only in certain parts of the world that will give you a true purple. So it was very, very expensive. So any garment, anytime you see a reference to purple garments, they imply royalty because that it was so difficult to make that. It was difficult and expensive to make a true purple. So here comes this prophet clothed in purple. There's your first sign that this is a divine presence, and you best acknowledge that. Then if you're a pirate and you capture him and you try to tie him up and the knots just won't hold, maybe that's another sign that you're dealing with someone that you should be a little cautious of or respectful of. He performs some familiar actions, I think, to some of us. For example, the water rolling over the deck suddenly becomes wine. Where else have we seen water turned into wine? If you come from a Christian tradition, that's a familiar act, and it does no disrespect, and I certainly mean no disrespect, to say that a tremendous number of stories of elements of the Christian tradition were co-opted from, were adopted from, were adapted from existing traditions. And that's how it works, right? There's no reason to have the celebration of Jesus's resurrection in the spring, except that it makes perfect sense, right? First of all, that's when things are reborn, but also there were in existence already elaborate festivals in place. So if you want your religion to be accepted, then you meet people where they are. We're already having these joyful fertility rituals. Hey, guess what? Let's connect them to our guy. So that's a bit of a diversion, but there it is. So the guy who decides, I don't care what you say. You tell me he's a god. I don't believe it. He's just some loser, and we're going to kidnap him. We're going to make a bunch of money. If you notice where he's from, the guy's from Thrace. Thrace is that northern part, just to the east of Macedonia. And that's the clue that that guy's a barbarian. Anytime Thrace is mentioned, he's a bad guy. So the chief pirate, a guy from Thrace, it's like, no, he's not a god. He's just a guy. And he gets punished. He gets punished for that, horribly punished. And Hamilton says, none lived long who strove with gods. One of the worst things you can do as a human is try to put yourself on a level with the god or goddess. And so by not worshiping him, by not recognizing him, that's what happens. Dionysus goes to the underworld. And then Hamilton dwells pretty extensively on the duality inherent in this story. The Greeks were quite comfortable with that, much more so than we are. That wine does have a good side and a bad side. Some of us seem to just be hardwired. It's always good, it's always bad. So, there's a line there. There's a line between the wine that makes us feel warm and friendly and socially appropriate, and the moment that it becomes problematic. So this is Dionysus. This is his nature. He has a dual nature. He has some brutal and horrible elements to his tale, but he also has some gentleness and some kindness. So we see a lot. And then at the end of that chapter, Hamilton says he experiences a joyful resurrection, which provides the assurance that death does not end all. And certainly anyone in a Christian tradition understands that concept, that I want there to be something after death. And we talked about the fact that the Greeks did not interpret that to mean eternal punishment or eternal reward, that it was just a different aspect of life. So besides suffering, Dionysus' story is also different in the values that it conveys. His is not a story of intellectual thought. His is not a story of self-awareness or self-control. Dionysus personifies passion. So we have come to use that term only in terms of, certain male-female relationship. passion. But in fact, passion, the passion of the Christ is about suffering. Passion is an intensely physical experience. Right? So Dionysus' story kind of reflects that mindlessness, madness, self-indulgence. And that's another reason it wasn't Homer's kind of story. Soldiers have to be disciplined. Soldiers have to exercise great self-control. They can't slip past that line into madness. So Dionysus' story has much different values, but he does represent male fertility, escapism. His revelers dressed in animal skins, they drank, they behaved in violent ways. These things really alarmed non-believers. And over time, the stories of Dionysus and the rituals celebrating his gifts gradually became merged with his half-brother Apollo. So the oracle at Delphi. Have you heard of the oracle at Delphi, or that term means something, the oracle? Those, when someone went to the oracle, it was because they were facing a dilemma and they needed answers. Either they needed to know the future or they needed to know which path to take. So they would go to this priestess. Well, these were Apollo's priestesses. So the oracle at Delphi was the oracle of Apollo. It was believed to be Apollo speaking as directly as possible to humans. So what would happen is you go to one of the priestesses, tell her your deal, she would disappear and return from this cave and give you some kind of answer. Well, archaeologists have discovered that there are hallucinogenic fumes in these caves. So when the priestess would return, she would often be speaking in tongues or sounding completely crazy. So you kind of always heard what you wanted to hear. If you went to the oracle, she would come out and say something completely nonsensical because she was stoned out of her mind. You'd say, oh, it's exactly what I thought I was supposed to do. So it's a complicated process. It sounds real simple. I'm going to go to this priestess. She's going to tell me what I need to do. I'm going to follow that direction. A lot more nuanced. But this notion of madness, of loss of control, that's part of the evidence that scholars would say that Dionysus' story was merged with Apollo. It makes the very intellectual Apollo a little looser. It makes the Dionysus a little more intellectual. So those stories made it, that combination made the stories a little more acceptable. And literary scholars believe that this joining of the intellectual and the passionate give us tragedy, give us a great Greek literary form, the classical tragedy, which had also a pretty clear pattern, classical tragedies. So that's Demeter and Dionysus, mankind's best friends. So our other chapter for today, our other big topic, another big topic today are the creation stories, and plural. Until I read Hamilton first, I don't know how many decades ago, I was under the impression there was one creation story from the ancient Greeks, that it was always Uranus, Gaia, Cronus and the Titans, etc. So I'd never read until I read this book, The Five Races, the story of the five races, or the story of Pyrrhus and Deucalion, where you cast the bones of your mother over your shoulder. Those were new and kind of interesting. But certainly the more familiar story comes only from Hesiod. Homer would have never had any reason to tell that story, whereas Hesiod did, because he was promoting worship of Zeus, and it explains how Zeus came to be. So, like Dionysus, Zeus has many of those elements, many of those hero motifs, right? He certainly has divine or extraordinary parents. He certainly has an extraordinary birth story, being, wrapped in having a stone substituted for him, and then being carried away to have his divine childhood. and then undertakes a quest to get rid of his wicked father and bring order and reason to the world. So Zeus was the original hero archetype. You know that term archetype, an original pattern or model. I assume that we do. I rarely assumed that my community college students understood that concept. So we sometimes had to stop and talk about Jung a little bit and talk a little bit about that archetype, yeah, that original pattern. So Zeus is the archetype of the hero. Did you get a little lost in the telling of this tale? Anybody find themselves having to go back and reread? Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to keep track of. It's a lot to take in. What I would typically recommend when I was teaching this is to literally make yourself a family tree. It's not a perfect here, but it would help to start. You start with Gaia, and then mysteriously, and I love the fact that Hamilton says repeatedly, he didn't feel the need to explain how or why. Things just happen. So we start with Gaia. She gives birth to or produces to Uranus, and together they somehow mysteriously create the first thing, which is love, and that's then accompanied by radiant day. If you kind of get these things into a structure, it's a little easier to envision. Something that is critically important, and it's always puzzled me why it's left out of this particular version. So we have Gaia and Uranus. Uranus hates his offspring, those first ones, the 100. I mean, kind of see why. They sound pretty hideous. So he imprisoned them inside Gaia. So if you imagine the Earth to have the enormously powerful forces, and when there's an earthquake, oh yeah, I know what that is. Yep, those kids are acting up. So Gaia and Uranus. So Gaia finally, asks her children for help. Kids, this can't go on. One of you has to help me. So finally, Cronus agrees. All right. So here we have the first example of the son overthrowing the father. The son has to symbolically kill the father to come into manhood. A friend who was a therapist and talking about teenage boys said, some kids launch easy, some kids launch hard. And that has occurred to me often, that some young men simply come into their own with great support from their father. And some boys from early teenage years on have to butt heads with that father figure over and over and over. And some fathers have trouble with their sons becoming men, becoming their own men. So we kind of have this classic pattern that goes back to the beginnings of the universe. So Cronus says, yeah, I'm going to do it. Does anyone remember what Hamilton says Cronus did to his father in order to defeat him, banish him? Interestingly, she says, Cronus wounded him terribly. Well, in literally every other version of this story that you will read, if you do a quick Google of the Greek creation story, he wounds him terribly by castrating him. Doesn't that seem significant? Doesn't taking away his father's sexual power seem deeply significant in some way? It has just puzzled me every time I've run across it. He wounds him terribly. And it's the severed genitals that he casts into the ocean that create the foam from which Aphrodite is born. I mean, everything about that. Just let that swirl around a little bit. So Cronus castrates his father and thereby banishes him because, if you can't procreate, you're kind of done, right? So doesn't necessarily kill him, but he is now banished to the heavens where he will remain. So now we get a new set. Now we have Cronus. He takes as a wife his sister Ray. Cronus hears a prophecy that one of his children will overthrow him. Well, we can't have that, right? And that is why he gives every child to be swallowed. And finally, Ray gets smart. When she has another baby, she's like, you're not getting that one. You're gonna take a baby-sized stone and swaddle it and give it over. So then Zeus comes of age, terrible battles ensue. They need help from the giants. They have to release the Kraken. That's not in any way what happens, but we have to release some of the monsters from the underworld to help. There's an epic battle, but by the time Zeus and his brothers, sisters, cousins, offspring, by the time we have this pantheon, each member of which reflects a part of social order, then we have the beginning of a rational universe. It may not seem like the rational universe we might create, but in fact, if everyone has their sphere, everyone has their area, and there's someone to go to for every kind of human need, you can have a universe you can see and understand. They're human-like. No member of the pantheon, even Hephaestus, who's the god of the forge, he's not a monster necessarily. He's crippled, he's lame. And there are a couple of different stories about how that happened and why that happened. But the gods and goddesses look like us. We're done now with terrifyingly unfamiliar beast gods. And that's the part that sets the Greeks apart, as the creation of this collection of gods and goddesses. And they were not meant to be followed in the way that we might think of gods or goddesses. We're supposed to do like they do and try to emulate them. That was not at all the way the Greeks saw the pantheon. It's 10:20. I've got a PowerPoint about creation stories in general that I want to share, but maybe this is a good time to take 10 minutes and then we'll come back to that, because it might take a little bit longer. I've got 10:20. I'll see you at 10:30. So, yeah, the stories, I'm looking at chat and I appreciate your comments and yeah, it's a little hard to follow. It's a lot. Gail, as far as the Romans and the Greeks, they were such different. So the Greeks were first. The Greeks were travelers. They wandered over to the Roman Peninsula. They interacted with the Romans. As the Roman civilization began, they were just profoundly different. They're very warlike. They are conquerors. They're engineers. They're not abstract thinkers. They're so because their values were different. It isn't so much one set was religious and one set was something else, but every culture creates or retells or shares or preserves stories that reflect their own values. So the Romans' values were quite different from the Greeks. And so because they were not abstract thinkers, it was easy for them to say, okay, we've had some interaction with these guys across the water. They've got this whole collection of gods and goddesses. We'll start there and just kind of make them our own. So the Romans came much later, and the changes reflected their culture's values. So neither one were really religious in the way we might think of it, as to be followed, but they were both reflective of very different stories. One of the when we talk about creation stories, first of all, if you read that David Leeming piece, that introduction that I sent a link to, he explains, every culture has an origin story or a creation story. We seem to need to know where we came from. I think families are like that as well. I wonder if the whole 23andMe being able to precisely map your origins will have any impact on the stories that we tell about where we come from. I mean, it's a little different to know I am 37% German than to tell the story of my great grandfather carrying this platter on the boat with him, So those stories that center us, and we probably all tell stories about maybe our kids or our siblings that kind of indicate, oh, I knew she was going to be a risk taker from the time she was tiny, right? So we seem to have that need to see where we came from, but partly because it shows us where we are. It shows us who we are, and it shows us where we are. So creation stories are a part of every culture. They are different in that they reflect the elements of that culture, but one of the things that made Joseph Campbell so well known in this field is he was really the first to do a sort of cross-cultural study of myth. So scholars knew myth existed, scholars knew myths were important. He was really one of the first to say, no, they're also strikingly similar. So maybe they say as much about humans as about Greeks or Egyptians or Mesopotamians or the Celts. Maybe there's elements of both to these stories. His famous work is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And that quick version of the hero motifs comes from that idea that while every culture has heroes that reflect them, those heroes have some pretty striking similarities. And from there, he went on to note, for example, how many cultures have a flood story as part of their repertoire. And you can certainly understand everything about a flood story being handy, right? So first of all, it's something that a lot of people would have experienced in both its terror and in what it leaves behind, which is more fertile soil, at least back in the day before it left behind polluted soil. But back in the day, a flood was both a regular and expected act, inherently destructive, but at the same time, inherently productive. So if you farm river bottom lands, you're gonna have a flood every 10 years, but those other 9 years that's gonna be really productive farmland. So this notion of a flood as both immensely powerful, immensely destructive. Even landlocked places have flood stories, even places that didn't experience firsthand a flood, that didn't look around and say, oh, this must be how everything got started, seem to have a flood story. So it's destructive, it's revitalizing, it's important in every way. So that was Joseph Campbell. If you have you heard of Joseph Campbell? Is that a familiar name to anybody? A little bit yes, a little bit no. Okay. Well, one of the most fascinating things to me was when I discovered, you can't study myth for even 2 minutes without running across his name in any meaningful way. He truly was a pivotal figure. But the thing that tickled me so much was to discover how much a part of our culture he really was. He was not some scholar locked away in Britain in an ivory tower. You know, he was, and in fact, when George Lucas, that's probably a familiar name, when George Lucas had some kind of space movie in mind, he knew the story he wanted to tell. He had this good versus evil set in space idea, and he couldn't quite get a handle on a structure, a framework for this movie. He remembered reading A Hero with a Thousand Faces in college, and he reached out to Joseph Campbell. They became like buddies. They hung out. Joseph Campbell would go to Skywalker Ranch and hang out, and George Lucas gave him full credit for Star Wars, for the immense, culture changing thing that became Star Wars. So his influence is not only academic, it's also very much a part of pop culture, and directly taken from, and when we look at that heroic pattern, and again, teaching mythology, the kind of student who would be drawn to that was often very, very familiar with the whole Star Wars experience, and could speak very knowledgeably about every character and in which movie or movies they appeared, etc. And it used to just tickle me to death. So there's actually a really beautiful video of that Bill Moyers made, and there is not a better American journalist in my world than Bill Moyers. So Bill Moyers filmed conversations between the two of them at Skywalker Ranch, and it's lovely. I'll send a link if you're interested. They talk about everything, every kind of thing. A really striking comment to me is, religion is just a container for faith. Something about that seems so profound to me, that the container itself is less important than the faith that it holds, the faith that we choose to infuse. So creation stories. Every culture has one. Let's see if I can- See that okay? If anybody wants a copy, it's certainly welcome. I'll grab some notes. So some terms that are used in studying creation stories are cosmogony, so the birth of the world. Some stories are considered to be cosmogony. Cosmology is the study of the world, and in particular, a term that we use in relationship to Hesiod's story of the origins of the world are theogony, the story of the birth of a god, because that's why Hesiod wrote down, that's why Hesiod composed, that's a better word to use in terms of these stories. Why Hesiod composed this creation story was for the purpose of encouraging devotion to Zeus. So the first term that we want to clarify, I think we tend to think of chaos as a lot of noise. We might refer to a scene as chaotic. There's a lot happening, a lot of noise, a lot of action. It was actually, in its origins, the term was the exact opposite. Chaos was in fact the opposite of sound and movement. So it was more frightening. It comes from the words related to gap and yawn. It has to do with sort of an opening in which there is nothing. And again, you can look at the origin story or the creation story from a number of different cultures, one of them being the Bible. So Genesis begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless, empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So in the beginning, there was nothing. Pretty common concept. Minimize meaning to see. I don't know how you see the whole thing. Maybe you can. So Hamilton 2 notes that darkness produced the Fates. The Fates were the 3 women who controlled the span of your life. They were the weavers, and if your thread was cut, that was it. Your end was done. So the Fates. But darkness also produced Nemesis. And we know that term, and it's kind of fun for me to see who Nemesis actually was. She was the goddess of divine indignation. I just love everything about that. Retribution, who punished excessive pride, aka hubris. She punished evil deeds, and she punished undeserved good luck. So it's not just, hey, I'm just lucky. It's, yeah, but you didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. So you're gonna get punished if you came by something good in the wrong way. And she was the personification of resentment aroused in gods and mortals by those who committed crimes with impunity or enjoyed undeserved luck. So this is the idea that we're hardwired to resent those things. That's not fair. Our essential fairness. Another concept in these creation stories is the concept of monsters. And monsters, that term implies for us something automatically evil. Like monsters are frightening, they are going to hurt us, we should fear them. But that's kind of a poor translation of the term. The term itself, literally, that the Greeks use in place of the term monsters that we use, literally means that at which you point in surprise. So it wasn't a scary thing that's going to kill you. It's like, holy cow, look at that. Wow, look at that thing. Oh yeah, I can make myself disappear. So you recognize at least some of these, I'm guessing. This is Medusa with the snake hair. Medusa's punishment was to, for her beauty, was to have this hair, but also to turn men to stone if they looked at her. This monster is the Hydra, 9 heads. Every time you cut one off, another one grew. It took Hercules himself to defeat the Hydra. This is called the Chimera or Chimera. Pronounce it however you like. Head of a lion, the body of a goat, the tail of a serpent, wings. This is every kind of creepy. One thing that's kind of interesting about possibly the Hydra, but certainly the Chimera or Chimera, is that some scholars believe this came from the Greeks observing fossils in which different kinds of things died on top of each other. So fossil records are not always crystal clear. Here's the exact fossil of a whole intact dinosaur. If it was a common place for animals to drink or to gather for some reason, lots of animals died in the same place. So archaeologists often have to kind of unpack the head of one thing and the tail of another. And so some scholars speculate that the Greeks actually saw something, a fossilized something that had, wings and a serpent's tail. So again, the literal, their sort of literalness may be that. And you can, if you Google that, you can even see pictures of what has led scholars to speculate on that. Here we have the Minotaur, the half man, half bull, possibly representing our own dual nature of the man and beast. And the Furies. Of course, they're female. Of course they are. And they are the personification of a bad conscience. They haunt you, the Furies. So most creation myths, and in fact, most myths in general, have these shared characteristics. They reflect the physical characteristics of the environment. So Maori, there's a Maori story that explains storms and one that explains fish. Whereas the Apache origin stories, they don't mention water or fish. The Apaches, that was not a part of their physical environment. The Norse myths, of course, involve ice and cold. The Potawatomi, which was a Great Lakes tribe, Native American tribe, in their stories, the earth floats on water. They lived in the midst of water amidst the Great Lakes. And the Hebrews lived in the desert, so their stories reflect paradise. Paradise is a lush garden, because if you're in the midst of a desert, that's what you long for more than anything. Stories also reflect the superiority of the storyteller's own people. There's a tribe in Africa called the Mossi or Maasai, and in their stories, black skin is skin that is the least polluted by arrogance. It is the purest. I love that. But then the Potawatomi, that Great Lakes tribe, they say that black skin and white skin were both mistakes, and they finally got it right with their skin tone. And in Hebrew stories, the Hebrews' ancestors negotiated a special deal for their own people. They were the chosen ones, and they negotiated that special covenant. Also common to myths in general, creation myths, is that the role of women is either omitted or women are somehow the source of trouble. Yes, I'm talking about you, Pandora. Women were created in that story as a punishment. Zeus's punishment to men was women. Yeah. It's not a big stretch to talk about misogyny. Myths also justify the exploitation of nature, sometimes justify the exploitation of other humans, to go forth and hold dominion over animals. The gods told the Apache that plants and hoofed animals would be their food. In Chinese myth, upper class people are handmade, but lower class people are mass produced. Kind of early sociology there. And many, many myths begin in darkness and then light is generated. Pretty obvious why that would be an important thing. Safety and security, and storytelling itself. And in these stories, in these cultures' creation myths, there are typically just a handful of ways that this happens. And this is, again, across hundreds of collections of stories. And often from chaos. Many stories feature a cosmic egg or a mound, a maternal mound. And that mound is often taken from the physical surroundings. Many stories feature world parents who are somehow separate and must find each other. Many stories, especially those from cultures near water, have this process of earth diving, of having to dive down and bring up land to begin civilization. And then many stories also feature emergence from another world. So we gradually come to humanity from another world. Some common figures, particularly in creation stories, a creator, or sometimes a creatrix, and often a trickster. And the notion of a trickster, in Norse mythology, it's Loki. In Greek mythology, it's often, Hermes is often one who plays tricks. But a trickster sounds pretty benevolent. It sounds like, oh, someone who just likes a practical joke. But in fact, trickster tales, trickster figures were often destructive and vindictive. It wasn't a fun concept. Most creation stories include a first man and a first woman, and they often have the flood hero. So they certainly have a flood element, but the figure like Noah who returns us to life is a common figure. bring us back. So those are some elements of creation stories. Generally, one of the things that truly struck me in the piece, the introduction to that dictionary of creation myths, was when I was working with students in writing classes, and I wanted them to understand the concept of revising a document, and I wanted them to understand it was more than just correcting spelling. I would write revision on the board, but I would put a hyphen between re and vision, so they could kind of, literally see, oh, a revision means another look at the whole document. Well, when this little piece put that little hyphen in recreation instead of recreation, it brought me up short too. Well, of course, that's what play is. Of course, that's what recreation is. It's recreation. We're revitalizing ourselves. So this notion of recreation, I thought was really interesting. So creation myths, what you want to look for. If there's a culture that you're particularly interested in and you want to go look at other creation myths, what I used to like to do is bring in a lot of stories. I would bring in a copy of Genesis. I would bring in a copy of different Native American tribes, there's Egyptian stories, and then look for those patterns, look for those common elements, look for those elements of creation stories. So if there's a culture that you're particularly interested in, when you look at their creation story now, think about the way that it reflects the physical characteristics. Think about the way that it reflects the storyteller's own people. So the other thing that I wanted to get us a grounding in, a little short on time, but I think we can still talk about it a little bit, is that heroic pattern, that image that I sent. And unfortunately, for me to do screen sharing, I have to have opened that, and I think I did not. Have that open. But if you took a look at the link that I sent that shows you Campbell's diagram, and that's going to be really hard to talk about without looking at it together. Let me give you a bare bones overview of it. We're just about out of time anyway, and maybe we'll start with that next time, taking a little closer look at it. So first of all, it goes counterclockwise. I don't know why that is, but many people have sort of summarized. Oh, thank you, Anne. There it is. Takes a village. So this was the way Joseph Campbell created this diagram. What many people have summarized it, tried to, I don't know, freshen it up, and they make it go clockwise. I think it's interesting that there's that, I don't know, just the sense that everything has to go a certain direction. But this is the way Campbell summarized it. So if you remember our hero motifs, we start up at the top there with someone born to extraordinary parents. A little side note. If you saw the movie Big Fish, Ewan McGregor, and it's the most charming movie in the world to me. I love it beyond reason, but it also has every single element of the heroic pattern. And in the movie Big Fish, when our main character is born, his mother has to work so hard to push him out that he actually shoots down the hall in the hospital, and the doctors can't catch him. He's slippery like a fish. It's so absurd, but it comes directly from from mythology and from this pattern. So at some point, the hero has his, and I'm sorry, they were almost all his. So we're just going to make it easy and say his call to adventure. Sometimes literally a voice saying, "You have to avenge me." Other times more subtle. Help us, Obi-Wan, the hologram from Star Wars, right? There's a call to adventure, again, which the hero may be reluctant to accept. It doesn't make him any less heroic to say, I don't know. I mean, why would I want to do that? That sounds dangerous. I don't know. So he was no less heroic for being reluctant, but eventually he does go. And before he gets fully into his quest or his adventure, he picks up a helper, sometimes more than one. So we get the Tin Man, we get the Cowardly Lion, right? We gather up these helpers before we really begin. The Wizard of Oz fits this perfectly. So next time you watch that, I've had students tell me it was ruined for them because now they can't help but watch for all these things. So then we cross the threshold of adventure, which might involve any of these extraordinary events. So the threshold crossing may involve a brother battle, a dragon battle, dismemberment, crucifixion, abduction, a night sea journey, a wonder journey, or even entering the whale's belly. Once we're in the adventure, we're going to meet a number of tests, obstacles, things in our way, and the helpers are brought along so that we can get past them. So it takes the Cowardly Lion to save us from this particular trial. So this is what Campbell called the nadir of the mythical round. So this is the essential point. This is when the quest, the object of the quest is attained. And that may take place through a sacred marriage, through father atonement, through apotheosis, that means becoming a god, if that's not a familiar term. Or there may be an elixir, something that must be brought back to the real world to save the kingdom, the family, the country, the globe, whatever it is, that elixir. So once we have it, it's not smooth sailing. There's flight, often pursued. So we have to now take what we know or have and get it back to finish the whole cycle. The returning to the real world, the returning back to the original world may take the form of resurrection. Maybe there's a rescue, but there's some kind of struggle here. But then when we return, we have this elixir. And it's not necessarily a physical, it may not be the Holy Grail or a magic potion of some kind. It may be knowledge. It may simply be knowledge, but whatever it is, it then saves more than just the hero. So that's the picture. And if you go to that link, there's another little paragraph of explanation that may clarify some parts of this. But this is the essential hero's story, the hero's journey. And it forms the basis of a number of stories that we'll encounter as we go along. So, 11 o'clock, perfect. Look at that. So for next week, you can read any of the hero chapters, including chapter 13, the Trojan War. We'll talk about this pattern as it plays out in the Iliad. We'll talk about the Iliad in general. There is a link that I will send out. There was a psychiatrist who was working with Vietnam vets. And what he discovered was talking to them, telling them stories from the Iliad was enormously therapeutic because the Iliad is about the warrior ethos, warrior soldierly behavior. So he actually won one of those McCarthy grants. They call them genius grants. He got a pile of money with no strings attached, just because of this groundbreaking work that he did. And his book was Achilles in Vietnam. So I will send links to those things, to a couple of things. And again, the hero stories in Hamilton. What I meant by that is if you look at the table of contents, it's not quite as mysterious. She's got, in part 3, she's got 4 hero stories. She calls them great heroes before the Trojan War. I would kind of dispute that they were all great heroes, but there they are. And then in part 4 of the Hamilton text, says the heroes of the Trojan War. So you can kind of read or look through or become familiar with the outlines of any of those hero stories, because we'll be talking about them as representative of this pattern. Again, okay, slides, you got them. I'll send, I think I can send the PowerPoint, although it's pretty old by now. Send the PowerPoint if you're interested. I'll send links to the NPR story, and I'll send a couple other links. Would you like to get them earlier in the week rather than later? Would that be helpful? Okay. Esther says, I don't care, I'm gonna read them 5 minutes before class anyway. And it's perfectly fine. Okay, I'll send them midweek. Yeah, and then we'll see where we go from here. We'll talk about heroes next. Thanks. Okay, good to spend time with you all. Thank you very much. I will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Those other links were really good too.